Last time on Serilution.
What's happening?
Many months later.
It's so dark in here. Oh god, it's so bright. Jeez, it's like a DS backlight in the morning. Oh, there's that weird sound. It's either the sounds of space or that one freezer from my cabin. It sounds like Darth Vader. Oh, hey look. It's that one freezer from my cabin. It sounds like Darth Vader. And it's unplugged. Guess that means I'm in space. But what's that noise? There's another one. It sounds like voices? Now what are they talking about? Oh look, subtitles. Handy. Let's see what Intel? Games. Hunter? Maybe incentive? What could they be talking? Oh. We would like to play?
Let's go!
Back in the day of the N64, 3D was the hot new thing, but it was very much in its infancy. And while some games succeeded, like Mario 64, others had it pretty rough. I'm looking at you, Bubsy! And for whatever reason, the Metroid series skipped out on the whole third generation of consoles, and the series was silent for 8 whole years. But then, it finally happened. When the GameCube released, Retro Studios made their move and released Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime looked clean back in the day and continues to age gracefully now. But looks wasn't all this game had going for it, since right at the start of the game, you'll notice something a little different than prior Metroid titles. Yes, this game not only gained a dimension, but a whole new first-person perspective, changing this series genre from third-person action-adventure to first-person shooter. And the game uses this new perspective to great effect, as you'll have steam impair your vision and blasts from enemies shake the screen as electricity short-circuits your visor. These effects that temporarily blind you, coupled with the eerie music of Metroid Prime locales, makes for a Metroid game that has a sense of loneliness and unease unlike any Metroid before it. In this isolated world, you'll find a pretty familiar setup to old Metroid games, where you'll have a large map to explore filled with many collectibles and bosses. But the first-person perspective does wonders in raising the stakes. For example, in older Metroid games, if a Metroid attacked you, it would be annoying, but you'd drop a bomb or something to shake it off. No biggie. But in Metroid Prime, if you see one of these floating abominations, they'll sprint at you without hesitation, and your whole vision will be blocked by their terrifying insides and fanged teeth. This scarred me so much as a kid back in the day that I still get shivers whenever I have to enter a room with Metroids in it, and I'll do all that I can to avoid it. Luckily though, we've got some new mechanics to deal with these freaky foes, like the all-new Visor system. Default is the combat visor, which is now used to lock on to enemies, so it's easier to deal with them in a 3D space. But we also get the scan visor, which is the key to Metroid Prime's world building. With the scan visor, you can scan various objects in the environment to interact with them, and receive info on enemies, or lore stories about the ancient Chozo civilization and space pirates. Most of these scans are completely optional, but if sought out, slowly unravel the game's mysterious story. My favorite scans to find were always the space pirate logs, specifically the ones that hint at the mysterious enemy who's been tearing through the space pirates' defenses. You'll never see this enemy in the game until you fight it at the very end, and only hear about it through these space logs, which slowly builds up this intense threat in your mind that you can only imagine what its true form might be. And fortunately, for those who like to get straight to the action, most of these scans are completely optional, meaning that whether you're a slow-paced player or a go-go-go kind of guy, the game's pacing is just straight up good. Similar to Super Metroid's first couple hours, in Metroid Prime you'll explore the 3 main areas and eventually end up looping back to the initial crash site, where you started your whole adventure. But now you'll have missiles, the Varia suit, Morph Ball, bombs, and the Boost Ball. It's at this point the game opens up and lets you explore all those areas you've already been to, but with all your new power-ups to open up new paths. Unfortunately, there were many times where I'd go down a long, winding path feeling like I'm on the correct path, only to hit a roadblock at the very end, which I don't have the power up for yet, and have to backtrack all the way back. This is remedied slightly by the hint system, which just tells you where to go next after a little while, but I feel like there could be a better in-between system where the game is designed to show you the way instead of directly telling you where to go. Like, instead of putting a roadblock at the end of a long linear path, at least put it near the beginning so I don't feel like I'm wasting my time and have to backtrack all the way out. But once you do find that right path, Metroid Prime feels oh so great. Like when you discover the thermal visor. You'll trek deep into a space pirate lab, fighting many difficult enemies along the way, and you'll see Metroids trapped behind glass walls. And as you push deeper into the dangerous lab, you'll find the thermal visor, but the second you pick it up, the room goes dark, glass shatters, and you hear that horrible Metroid cry. Not only are you trapped in the dark, but the most terrifying enemies in the game are coming straight for you. So you must equip your new thermal visor to see the heat signatures of the Metroids and space pirates, and find the path out as you backtrack back to the beginning. I personally hated this section as a kid because it always gave me the creeps. I already can't handle Metroids by themselves, but you take away my vision and play this music to top it off? Okay, yeah, I'm like mega spooked. But because of all these elements that work together in this moment, it remains so memorable to me as a high-paced escape from the dark depths of space pirate hell. And when I finally make it back to the bright open air of Phendrana drifts and that soft music starts playing, I can finally breathe a sigh of relief that I never have to go through that terror ever again. Metroid Prime is filled with many memorable moments like this, and the effect is only amplified by the landscapes, music, and theming of the areas, like the peaceful isolation of Phendrana drifts and the hot tension of Magmoor Caverns. On top of these intense sequences with normal enemies, the game also houses some excellent bosses, like the Omega Pirate. In this tense fight, you have to bob and weave around the arena and take out all the space pirates that the Omega Pirate spawns in, each of which have a specific beam weakness. And not only are you cycling through your beams to take out these little enemies that the boss is spawning, but you also have to damage the boss when you can. But there's also floor hazards that you have to be aware of that'll damage you if you stand on them. It's a difficult fight that'll test all your combat skills. And you'll be rewarded with the Great Phazon Suit, which is one of the few new power-ups in this game. And it'll give you access to the entire rest of the map of Metroid Prime. And with the Phazon Suit acquired, you're finally on to the most controversial part of the game. The artifact collecting. Essentially, you have to hunt down 12 different artifacts that are spread across the entire game's map to get access to the final area and final boss. I have some mixed feelings on this part of the game since, while it is good to have some laid-back exploration with all your abilities to do a little victory lap around Tallon 4, the issue is that they don't give you all the artifact hints immediately, and instead you have to collect 7 of them first and then go back later to get the last 5 hints. The whole thing would have been a lot less painful if you could just search for them all at once. But if you've picked up a few throughout the game, it won't be quite as painful. And after the long search is over, you'll be treated to 2 great boss fights, both of which have been hinted at throughout the game. And the final boss of Metroid Prime is a dynamic fight which utilizes all your different beams and visors for a great finale to a great game. Now we enter our next adventure, taking place right after the first, Metroid Prime 2 Echoes. And right away, there's a huge change in player motivation that struck me and doesn't sit too well. You see, in Prime 1, you're a lone bounty hunter investigating a distress signal, and this leads you into getting involved with the space pirates, the ancient Chozo race, and Phazon. The end goal in Prime is unknown and steeped with mystery, and you'll slowly learn about it through lore tablets that talk about a mysterious poison that's plagued the planet. This mystery drives you to discover and learn more about the world, and each little information that you find makes the game all the more interesting. But Metroid Prime 2? It says, nah man, who needs mystery? You meet this bug man and he just says, hey, these dark guys are evil, so you gotta kill them, so you can save me, the good guy. Why? Well, cause what else are you gonna do? Team up with the Galactic Federation? I mean, come on. Essentially, The game changes from the player creating their own motivation to explore to the game being like, yeah, I need you to go explore, so go beat these 3 temples that each have their 3 magic keys to unlock them. The game isn't about exploring a world anymore, it's about checking things off a list one by one. First you have to go collect 3 keys to get into the Dark Temple. Check. Then you gotta beat the boss guarding the Light Energy. Check. Then you gotta bring the Light Energy to the Light Temple. Check. Then you gotta go back to the Bugman, tell him what a good job he did, and the Bugman will open up a new area. Check. Rinse and repeat this 3 times and the game will be over. Being designed like this immediately limits the game's scope and leaves not a lot of room for interesting discoveries. The world themes of this game also struck me as less interesting. Instead of themes like the red lava of Magmoor, the greens of the Tallon Overworld, and the blues of Phendrana Drift, we get a nice brown palace, and then for the second world we get a tan desert. Like, come on. And while we're at it, like, where's the music in the wasteland? I mean, listen to this. It's just like a heartbeat and white noise, and that's about all we got going for it. I know the game is supposed to be about isolation, but it doesn't have to be completely silent when you're exploring. But on to what I did really enjoy, the game's bosses. Many of them, like the Jump Guardian and Spider Guardian, are upgraded from normal enemy to boss status after they absorb one of Samus's power-ups. This is not only cool because the boss feels like a smooth extension of your prior fights with that enemy type, but you also get little hints at what the power-up will do through the boss fight, which gets you excited to use it. And while this does make some of the boss designs feel a little less unique, we also get some of the best boss fights in the series with Quadraxis and Dark Samus, the latter of which you follow throughout the game and was my main motivation to keep playing and the best part of the game, hands down. But back to the topic of exploring, remember those keys I mentioned earlier? Well, this game has you collecting them by hopping between the Light World and the Dark World, which is probably the most interesting mechanic introduced to Metroid Prime 2. With this dual world mechanic, you really get to understand the space that you're in and how they're interconnected. This leads into all kinds of puzzles concerning the world design that'll really challenge you in fun and unique ways. And thankfully, the map screen helps a ton with navigation of these worlds, since you can switch between the Light World and the Dark World with just the press of a button. Otherwise, this would be a nightmare to navigate. Since the game is so focused on collecting these Dark Temple keys, it makes the game turn into more of a collectathon instead of a game focused on exploration, where new abilities would unlock new areas. Instead, our new abilities unlock access to keys and bosses. And once you beat that area, the bug will be the one who allows you to access the new area, which in my opinion is a lot less exciting than discovering new areas on my own. It's like you gotta do your homework before you can go out and play in the world, and that's no good. Yet again, we have points where this game has large backtracking, like when you get deep into Torvus Bog and you're forced to go all the way back to the temple grounds to get the Seeker Missile. It feels like a waste of time, and since areas aren't as interconnected as Metroid Prime 1, you have to go through this backwards slog that takes a ton of time. And unlike Metroid Prime 1 as well, this isn't caused by the player going down the wrong route, it's just designed to be this obtuse. However, not to say that the whole game is filled with this nonsensical backtracking, as the game will often lead you to the convenient teleport right to the next progression item. Like when you're in Sanctuary and you need the Power Bomb, there's a quick little transport to Torvus Bog, which brings you right to the area in Torvus Bog that has the power-up you need to collect. And I gotta say, even though I was ripping on the game's theming of the worlds earlier, Sanctuary Fortress definitely saves this game. Its design with being a futuristic city in the sky is not only interesting to look at, but also brings a wealth of fun puzzles, many of which involve Morph Ball shiz, which I may be a little biased because Morph Ball is like my favorite power-up in Metroid Prime. After completing Sanctuary Fortress, we finally get the Light Suit, and thank goodness, because the Aeon Suit is atrocious and ugly. And now it's time for the Key Hunt, which mirrors the original Metroid Prime's Artifact Hunt. Thankfully, this time around it's much more manageable since there are only 8 keys to collect, and we can find most of them after getting the Dark Visor, which is gotten somewhere around the second temple. Although unlike Metroid Prime 1 where the keys were hidden behind puzzles, in Metroid Prime 2, the puzzle is more so about how to get to the area where the key is in the Dark World, which to me is much less interesting. So in the end, Metroid Prime's Key Hunt is a little bit better because it doesn't overstay its welcome as much, but as an overall experience, Metroid Prime 1 is a much better time. And now it's time for the moment no one was waiting for. Time for a quick visit to the only portable Prime. Unless you call this portable, which I do not. This game is essentially Metroid Prime Lite, where instead of having a massive interconnected world with all kinds of goodies, you'll get to explore much smaller areas that are maybe 6 or so rooms, and you'll have to find 3 artifacts to act as keys to enter the area's boss room. Kinda similar to the Dark Temple in Prime 2. A lot of things you'll find in regular Metroid Prime games are all here, but it's all just toned down a little bit to fit the handheld. And in my opinion, they did a pretty phenomenal job. This game is focused much more on making each room its own puzzle, instead of making the navigation of the world a puzzle itself. This is usually because every room seems to have these glowing orbs that act as small keys that let you get out of that said room and move on to the next room. This works pretty well for the game since it has smaller maps, but in the end, it doesn't really come off as interesting to me. Fortunately, we still have tons of content to scan on our Visor, and even if it's not as gripping as Prime 1, I still appreciate its inclusion. And thanks in part to these scans, each area feels like it has a distinct lore and vibe, which makes them all pretty memorable and unique to explore. But unlike previous Metroid Prime games, you're not the only hunter out on a mission. As the subtitle suggests, you'll come across a variety of bounty hunters on your journey, which will act as random mini-bosses that come out of nowhere. I really like these hunters and how they each have their own weapon types, but I wish they had a little more personality to make them a little more fleshed out. However, these hunters do get some time to shine when you beat a boss, as they'll try to stop you and take your treasure in a timed escape sequence. And if you do fail these sequences, they'll steal the treasure and you'll have to chase them down on a different planet to get the treasure back. This one little detail really sells the fact that hunters are competing with you to collect these treasures first. The biggest problem I found with this game though was the controls. I don't know if my hands are just too big, but this game has a painful control scheme where you have to use the touchscreen to aim and jump, and the D-pad to move your character. It works okay, and honestly it's probably the best they could do with the DS hardware, but I can only play this game for about an hour or so before my hands get seriously cramped. At first, I really thought it would just be completely unplayable and I wouldn't even be able to finish the game, but after a few hours, I kinda got the hang of it, and by the end, I was completely comfortable with the controls. But it definitely took a long time to get used to. And this sniper gun was the most helpful in alleviating any control problems, as you simply have to aim and shoot and don't have to move around as much. So, if you can overlook the very dated controls, you may just come to enjoy this Metroid Prime portable title. But it'll really just tide you over until the next big Metroid Prime title, and you should definitely go play those ones first. On to the third entry, and oh boy, where do I start with this one? So this game starts off unlike any other Metroid game. For the first hour or so, it's all action, with explosions everywhere and exciting story set pieces, and full voice acting.
These pirates are more fragile than they appear.
It's so radically different than any other Metroid game that it almost feels more like a Halo game than a Metroid game. But I was really into it, as long as it didn't last the whole game, because this much excitement and tension the whole time would wear me down eventually. You get so many encounters with Ridley early on, it's amazing, and it's awesome that you have all these buddies to help you out on your quest to save the planet, although right from the beginning I kinda suspected that I'd end up fighting these guys eventually. I mean, Nintendo doesn't just design interesting characters to be one-note side characters, and lo and behold, at the end of the jam-packed first hour of the game to save everyone is defeated by Dark Samus, Samus included. Luckily, we have just enough strength to activate the laser, which stops the meteor from crashing. From this point on, the game goes back to a more similar Metroid-style game where you explore these different areas at your own pace. But kinda like how Metroid Prime 2's areas felt more disconnected than Metroid Prime 1, Prime 3's areas are the most disconnected of them all. So disconnected, in fact, that they're their own planets entirely. For the first time ever, Samus can use her gunship to hop between planets. And I love this, because for the first time ever, Metroid Prime feels like a massive space adventure. The scope just seems so much bigger. But in reality, if you look closely, the areas you explore are about the same size as the 2 previous titles, just separated into different planets this time. And this means Metroid Prime 3 opts for a much more linear level design. Many planets are pretty much one and dones, and you'll hardly hop back and forth between them. There are a few times where you'll have to hop back to an old planet to get a new power-up, but the game will kindly give you a heads up when you need to do that, unlike Prime 2, which simply trusts you to remember. The nice thing with Prime 3 is that in its linearity, you're less likely to get stuck. But overall, I found the levels to be much more forgettable and smaller in scope because all these areas were only visited once. And let me get this straight, linearity isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely takes away from that classic Metroid feeling of unraveling the knot of the world as new areas open up. In Prime 3, you simply start at Planet 1, then go to Planet 2, then go to Planet 3, and then you win. Oh, but it wouldn't be a Metroid game without a key hunt at the end, and Prime 3 actually does the best key hunt in the whole series. In Prime 3, you discover the ship that was wrecked by space pirates, the Valhalla. And hidden on this ship is a key that's required to beat the game. In order to get this key, you'll need to find energy cells to restore power to the Valhalla that are spread throughout all the different worlds in the game. But what makes this hunt so much more bearable is that, first of all, there are only 7 cells, and second of all, you'll need 5 of them if you use your energy cells wisely. And unlike the artifacts and sky keys from the previous 2 games, most of the cells are pretty much right along the critical path, and sometimes are even required to be picked up in certain rooms before you can progress. Thanks to this, by the end of the game, I already had most of the energy cells, and was able to get the final key from Valhalla with relative ease. I also love the idea of the keys in the game that you find opening up a side dungeon that slowly opens up throughout the game. It gives you something to slowly work towards instead of the previous 2 games, which were just kind of a roadblock at the end. And other than the energy cells, collectibles are also as abundant as ever, but are much more generously given this time around. Most Metroid games, I get around 65% playing casually on average, but I got more like 85% of the collectibles in Prime 3, since just like the energy cells, many of the collectibles are placed along the critical path. And I'm not a huge fan of these power-ups being so easy to obtain because it makes it feel like Prime 3 has so much less to find on a revisit or 100% completion run. Fortunately, this doesn't necessarily lower the game's difficulty too much, although it's probably the easiest out of the 4 Prime games because of this. Power-ups also return, and the order is yet again jumbled up, making them all feel unique and fresh in their implementation. And we have many power-ups that incorporate motion controls, like the grapple lasso, which I actually love to use and feels very natural. And many of the new power-ups are hyper variants of the classic power-ups, like the Hyper Ball and the Hyper Missile. So the new power-ups were plenty refreshing in this game, while keeping some fan favorites around, like the Screw Attack, Grappling Hook, and Super Missiles. Also, Ice Missiles returned from Metroid Fusion as a permanent missile upgrade, since this game no longer has an Ice Beam. The game also starts you off with many classics like the Morph Ball Bomb, the Space Jump Boots, and Spring Ball, which leaves lots of room for these new power-ups to be added later on. So in my opinion, even though I enjoy the world and scope of Prime 3 thanks to the interactions with the other characters and the Federation, I'd still say that it's probably the weakest of the Metroid Prime trilogy because of its less interesting short burst level design that strays a little bit too far from the exploratory Metroid that I've come to love. So where does that leave us today as we wait upon Metroid Prime 4, the game that will probably release sometime between never and half past forever? Well, let's speculate what this next entry could look like by going through all the important elements of a Metroid game and what we expect to see in Prime 4. We'll be talking about the world design, environments, story, gameplay, and the many power-ups and collectibles. Let's get into it. As the series has gone on, Metroid Prime's worlds have drifted far away from being these large interconnected worlds, and I'd love to see a return to form with the world design of Metroid Prime 1. Prime 1 did a great job of leading you down these linear paths, but also allowing for non-linear exploration once you'd find a new power-up, and that would let you discover maybe a new area or a few collectible goodies. The game was great at slowly unlocking the farther you got along, but the map never got too overwhelming. For the environments in this game and places to visit, I think a few generic ones are fine, like forest, lava, and snow. But what would really be interesting is some of those more unique ones, like the Sanctuary Fortress. We hardly ever get to see what cities look like in Metroid, so perhaps we go to a planet this time that's population has long since left, and all that remains is a desolate, futuristic city. Perhaps some scans could even tell us a story of what the city was like once before. I really enjoyed interacting with all the characters in Prime 3, and it honestly was one of my favorite parts of the game. It was really interesting to finally see some of this Galactic Federation that we've heard so much about, as well as a few other bounty hunters in the world. But I think Metroid games still do best when you're in isolation and you have that sense of unease, so it might be interesting to start us off in a populated Galactic Federation city, but then due to some unknown entity attacking, the city gets destroyed and all the people abandon it, only for Samus to return years later after recovering from the attack to find out exactly what happened. And to be clear, I say unknown entity because I yearn for the days when Metroid Prime games were filled with that mystery and intrigue. And in the latest games, you pretty much know who the final boss is an hour into the game. But I'd much rather enjoy Metroid Prime being a game where you can slowly piece together the story through the logbooks, just like in Prime 1, with environmental storytelling or some other way I can't think of. I believe Metroid worked best on Wii with the motion controls for aiming, so we could use gyro controls on the Joy-Cons. The GameCube aiming was kind of rough since you had to stop moving to aim where you wanted to shoot, and one of the things I'd really like to see innovated on is the combat. You see, many bosses in Metroid Prime simply boil down to the basics of shooting and dodging, but I'd like to really see how some power-ups can be integrated into the boss fights. Metroid Samus Returns for 3DS has shown us how the grapple beam can be used to great effect in combat to tear enemies down off the ceiling, and it'd be really neat to see how a boss would look when it incorporates something like wall jumps or shine sparking into the battle. Rewards are only worth it if the player thinks they're worth it, and Metroid Prime's goodies sure are worth finding, though I prefer them to be a little more scarce and spread out like Prime 1 and 2, instead of being along the critical path like in Prime 3. As for what power-ups should be included, I believe Metroid's standard roll-up of power-ups is great, but if done like Prime 3 where they give you many of them at the beginning, this gives a lot of room for the designers to flex their creative muscles and make room for more unique power-ups, like perhaps a late-game phase dash that lets you phase through small walls in any direction. Kind of like a double jump, but with an added bonus of going through objects. So those are my ideas for Metroid Prime 4. Hopefully when the game ever does release, it follows some of these ideas to a certain extent. Although, honestly, if I had to pick just one thing, what I'm hoping for most is to have an interconnected world design instead of separate planets. If we can have just that, I have my fingers crossed that the rest will just fall into place.
And with that, I should finally be free. Oh, what's going on? This self-destruct sequence? I gotta get out of here. Come on, Derek. Think. I've got it. Beam me up, Scotty. Oh man, it's good to be back in the safety of my own home. Thanks, Scotty.
Visor.
Oh man, they just don't know when to give up, do they? Time to channel my inner Shaggy. Alright gang, let's get out of here! Well, I guess that apartment's gone, but I was kinda getting sick of Baltimore anyway, so I guess it's time to move.
Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you really enjoyed it and you want to check out more Metroid Serilution content, I did another video on the 2D Metroid titles back a while ago, and I'm hoping to do another Metroid video coming up soon here, but with a lot more green screen magic. Also, I'd like to take a moment to celebrate this channel's 1-year anniversary! Woo! I didn't really know what I was doing when I started this channel, and it's just kind of been a fun hobby to keep me going throughout this kind of weird year. So, thanks for all your support as always, guys, and I will see you later.